Imagine being worth billions, yet feeling completely powerless when your little girl whispers, "Dad, my ear hurts." In that moment, all the money, cars, and mansions meant nothing to him, because one tear from her eyes was worth more than his entire empire. What happened next changed this billionaire forever. "Dad, my ear hurts." Those 4 words echoed through the billionaire Richard Hamilton's luxurious mansion, like an alarm. Richard froze, dropping the pen in his hand. His adopted daughter, Amara, just 7 years old, stood at the doorway clutching her ear, tears streaming down her little face. Richard was a man known for building empires, for signing deals worth millions without breaking a sweat. But when it came to Amara, the little girl he had promised to protect forever, he felt powerless in moments like this. He rushed to her side, scooping her up in his arms. Her tiny body trembled, and her cries cut deeper into his heart than any business failure ever could. "Don't worry, princess. Dad's here. We're going to the hospital right now," he whispered, already heading for the garage. The mansion staff looked on in shock as their usually composed employer sped away, holding his daughter tighter than the steering wheel. The city lights blurred as Richard drove faster than he ever had before. Every few seconds he looked down at Amara, who rested against him, her face pale from the pain. "It hurt so bad, Daddy," she whimpered, pressing her small hand harder against her ear. Richard's chest tightened. He had built skyscrapers, bought islands, and closed billion-dollar deals. But at that moment, he would have given it all away for just one thing: his daughter's smile. As the car rushed through traffic, memories flooded back. He remembered the first time he saw her at the orphanage. Amara had been sitting in the corner, clutching a ragged teddy bear, her eyes filled with sadness, but also strength. Out of dozens of children, it was her eyes that pierced his heart. That day, Richard had promised her, "You will never be alone again. You will never cry alone again." Now, hearing her sobs, that promise burned in his heart. He pressed harder on the accelerator. Finally, the hospital's sliding doors came into view. Richard didn't wait for a valet or parking. He simply pulled up to the emergency entrance, lifted Amara in his arms, and shouted, "Please help. My daughter's in pain." Doctors rushed to them immediately, taking Amara from his arms and guiding her into an examination room. Richard followed until the nurses stopped him at the door. He was left pacing in the corridor like a caged lion. The billionaire who once commanded boardrooms with calm authority now looked like a frightened father, powerless and desperate. Every second stretched into eternity. He thought about his late wife, the woman who had dreamed of becoming a mother, but passed away before it could happen. Adopting Amara had been his way of honoring her memory, but over the years Amara had become more than a promise. She had become his heartbeat. Finally, after what felt like hours, the doctor stepped out. "Mr. Hamilton, your daughter has a severe ear infection. It's good you brought her quickly. Delaying even a day or two could have led to serious complications, even permanent hearing loss." Richard's heart dropped, then raced. "Is she going to be okay?" he asked, his voice cracking. "With antibiotics and rest, she'll recover fully," the doctor reassured. The words felt like air after drowning. Richard closed his eyes and whispered, "Thank God." He rushed back into the room, where Amara lay on a hospital bed. Her cheeks were wet from tears, but when she saw him, she reached out a trembling hand. "Daddy," she whispered softly, "you didn't leave me." Richard bent down, clutching her hand as if it were the most valuable treasure in the world. "Never, Amara. I will never leave you." That night, Richard refused to go home. He stayed by her side, pulling up a chair next to her bed. He adjusted her blanket when she shivered, held her hand as she fell asleep, and even fed her spoonfuls of warm soup when she stirred awake. The nurses watched in quiet admiration. They were used to wealthy parents who sent nannies or assistants. But this man, this billionaire, was different. He wasn't there because of guilt or duty. He was there because he loved his daughter more than anything in the world. As the night deepened, Richard looked at Amara's peaceful face and whispered to himself, "All the money, the cars, the mansions, none of it matters. She's my real fortune." By morning, Amara's fever had gone down, and the doctor smiled as he handed Richard a prescription. "She'll be fine, Mr. Hamilton." Just make sure she takes her medicine and gets plenty of rest." Amara looked up at her father with tired but hopeful eyes. "Daddy, it doesn't hurt as much anymore." Richard kissed her forehead gently. "That's because you're the bravest girl I know." As they left the hospital, cameras flashed. Reporters had caught wind of the billionaire at the children's ward. But Richard ignored them all. The only thing that mattered was the little hand clutching his. That evening, back at the mansion, Richard canceled all his meetings. He sat with Amara in the garden, reading her favorite storybook, making her laugh with silly voices. He realized that this was what true success felt like. Not applause from shareholders, but the sound of his daughter's laughter. From that day forward, Richard changed his priorities. He still ran his empire, but his schedule bent around Amara's school plays, bedtime stories, and weekend adventures. He made a new promise, not just to protect her, but to be present for every little moment of her life. Because, at the end of the day, it wasn't wealth that defined Richard Hamilton. It was love. And whenever Amara looked up at him with those bright eyes and whispered, "Daddy," he knew the greatest investment he had ever made was not in business, but in family. The city lights blurred as Richard drove faster than he ever had before. Tires screeched as he weaved through late-night traffic, every second feeling like an eternity. In the passenger seat, Amara whimpered, pressing her small hand against her ear, her head leaning against his chest. Her voice, weak and trembling, pierced his heart. "It hurts so bad, Dad," she whispered. Richard's jaw tightened. He had every luxury imaginable, private jets, endless cars, a chef who could cook any dish in the world. He owned skyscrapers that touched the clouds and signed deals worth more than most people could dream of. Yet, at that very moment, none of it mattered. Money couldn't erase his daughter's pain. His fortune couldn't silence her cries. His power meant nothing against the tears running down her cheeks. His mind raced wildly. What if he was too late? What if it was something more serious than just an earache? The thought alone made his chest ache as if someone had struck him. He looked at Amara's little face, pale from pain, and felt smaller than he had ever felt in his life. As the car sped down the highway, memories pulled him back. He thought of the very first day he met her. It was 3 years ago, at a quiet orphanage tucked away on the edge of a city. He hadn't planned on adopting a child that day. He was there to make a donation in his late wife's memory. But then, across the room, he saw her, a quiet little girl, sitting in the corner with a worn-out teddy bear pressed tightly to her chest. Her clothes were too big, her shoes scuffed, her face solemn. Yet her eyes told a story of strength far beyond her years. When their eyes met, Richard felt something inside him shift. He was a man who always trusted numbers, contracts, and logic. But that day, for the first time in years, he listened to his heart. He walked over, crouched down, and said gently, "Hi there." She didn't answer. She only hugged the teddy tighter. Still, Richard knew. That was the moment he decided. She's the one. She's my daughter. He had promised her then, in the middle of that quiet orphanage, that she would never be alone again. She would never cry without someone there to comfort her. She would never suffer in silence. And now, hearing her sobs in the car, that promise burned in his heart like a vow. He had to keep at all costs. Richard pressed harder on the accelerator, the city whizzing by in streaks of light. For the first time in years, he found himself whispering prayers he hadn't spoken since he was a boy. "Please, God, please, don't take her from me. Please, let her be okay." His voice cracked, and he tightened his grip on the wheel with one hand while holding Amara's tiny fingers with the other. "Daddy," Amara whimpered again, her eyes half closed. Richard leaned down just enough to kiss her forehead. His eyes burning with tears he refused to let fall. "I'm here, princess. Just hold on for me. We're almost there." Red lights meant nothing to him that night. Horns blared as other cars swerved out of his way, but Richard didn't care. The man who never broke the rules of business broke every traffic law on the books that night. He was no longer a billionaire. He was no longer the untouchable Richard Hamilton, CEO of Hamilton Enterprises. He was just a father, desperate to save his little girl. Finally, the glowing red cross of the hospital came into view. Richard's chest loosened just a little, though fear still gripped him. He pulled into the emergency entrance, so fast the car nearly skidded. Without a thought for parking or procedure, he jumped out, cradling Amara in his arms. Her tiny body felt heavier than the world itself. "Somebody help." Richard's voice roared through the automatic sliding doors, echoing off the sterile white walls. "My daughter's in pain. Please, somebody help her." Doctors and nurses immediately rushed forward, wheeling a stretcher toward him. One nurse gently touched Amara's shoulder. "Sir, please lay her down. We'll take her from here." But Richard couldn't let go. "She's my baby," he choked, clutching her tighter. His voice cracked, no longer the commanding tone of a powerful businessman, but the pleading cry of a father on the edge of breaking. "Sir," the doctor said firmly, placing a hand on Richard's arm, "we need to examine her right away. She'll be safe with us." For a moment, Richard hesitated. Then Amara opened her eyes just enough to whisper, "Daddy." That one word shattered him. His arms slowly loosened, and he laid her on the stretcher. As the medical team wheeled her away, Richard stumbled after them, his chest hollow, his knees weak. The automatic doors to the examination room slammed shut in his face. He was left outside, helpless, staring at the sterile door as if sheer willpower could break it open. He pressed both hands against his face, fighting the sting of tears. He had always been the man with answers, the man who could fix anything with the stroke of a pen. But now he realized something terrifying. All his billions meant nothing here. He couldn't sign a contract to take away her pain. He couldn't negotiate with fate. He couldn't buy back her health. All he could do was wait. And as the minutes dragged into what felt like hours, Richard Hamilton, the man who once believed he had everything, realized he had only one true treasure. It wasn't the skyscrapers that bore his name. It wasn't the private jets or luxury cars. It wasn't even the billions in his bank account. It was the little girl behind those doors, the one who cried out, "Dad, my ear hurts," and reminded him that at the end of the day, he wasn't just a billionaire. He was a father. And that role was the only one that truly mattered. Doctors rushed Amara into an examination room. Richard paced outside, his fists clenched, heart pounding. The billionaire who once intimidated boardrooms now looked like a lost child himself, his eyes darting to the door every few seconds, as if he could somehow will it to open. His mind, usually sharp and calculating, was a storm of fear. Minutes felt like hours. Every cough, every voice from behind the door made him flinch. He pressed his palms together and muttered prayers he hadn't whispered since childhood. "Please let her be okay. Please, don't take her away from me." What if it was something serious? What if he lost her? The thought made his chest ache in ways money could never fix. Finally, the door swung open and the doctor stepped out, removing his gloves. Richard rushed forward, his voice desperate. "Doctor, is she?" The doctor raised a hand to calm him. "Mr. Hamilton, your daughter has a severe ear infection. It's good you brought her immediately. Waiting longer could have caused permanent damage." Richard exhaled sharply, nearly collapsing with relief. His legs wobbled, and for a moment he gripped the wall just to steady himself. "Will she be okay?" His voice cracked in a way that shocked even him. "With proper treatment, yes," the doctor assured him gently. "She'll need antibiotics, rest, and close care. She's in pain now, but children bounce back quickly." Tears stung Richard's eyes, and he let out a breath he felt he had been holding for eternity. "Thank you, doctor. Thank you." When Richard stepped back into the room, his heart ached at the sight before him. Amara lay on the hospital bed, her small figure dwarfed by the sheets, her cheeks blotchy from tears. She looked so fragile, yet when she saw him, her lips trembled into a weak smile. Slowly, she lifted her little hand toward him. "Daddy, you didn't leave me," she whispered. The words broke him. Richard sat beside her immediately, tears forming in his eyes. He took her tiny hand in his large, trembling one, holding it tightly as if to anchor them both. His voice was heavy, filled with both pain and promise. "Never, Amara. I'll never leave you." Amara's eyes fluttered as she relaxed under his touch. "I was scared," she admitted softly. "I thought maybe I'd wake up and you'd be gone." Richard's throat tightened. He brushed her hair gently away from her face. Listen to me, sweetheart. I don't care what happens in this world. Meetings, money, work, none of that matters compared to you. You are my world. I will always be here. Her small fingers curled around his, and for the first time since the ordeal began, Richard felt her grip strengthen. The warmth of her hand against his palm reminded him that she wasn't just his daughter by adoption papers. She was his daughter by love, by bond, by something greater than any contract he had ever signed. The machines beeped softly in the background, and for once, Richard didn't hear the sound of deals, deadlines, or ringing phones. All he heard was his daughter's breathing, steady and calm now, as if she trusted that his presence alone was enough to keep her safe. He sat there for hours, refusing to move. When the nurse offered to bring him a blanket, he shook his head. I don't need anything. Just make sure she's comfortable. He fed her spoonfuls of broth when she stirred, adjusted her pillows, and even hummed softly to lull her back to sleep. In those quiet moments, Richard reflected on his life. He had spent years chasing wealth, believing success meant being the richest man in the room. Yet here, in this small hospital ward, he realized success was something entirely different. Success was being the father his daughter could reach for in her weakest moment. Success was hearing her say, "You didn't leave me," and knowing he never would. As Amara drifted off to sleep, Richard leaned down and kissed her forehead, whispering, "You're safe now, princess. I'll always fight for you." And in that instant, he knew no empire, no skyscraper, no deal would ever compare to the joy of simply being her dad. As the night passed, Richard stayed by Amara's side, refusing to leave even for a second. The steady beep of the monitor filled the room, but Richard hardly noticed it anymore. His entire focus was on the small figure lying in the hospital bed. He fed her soup slowly, holding the spoon carefully so she wouldn't spill a drop. He adjusted her blanket each time she shifted, tucking it around her like a protective shield. And when she stirred in her sleep, murmuring softly from the discomfort, he leaned close and sang to her in a voice so low and shaky he barely recognized it as his own. The nurses at the station peeked through the window more than once. They had seen countless parents sit by their children, but something about Richard stood out. This wasn't a man simply fulfilling his duty. This wasn't a parent sitting there out of guilt. This was something deeper. The billionaire's usually polished suit jacket was crumpled in the corner, his expensive watch lying forgotten on the bedside table. His tie had been pulled off hours ago. All that was left was a father whose entire world revolved around one little girl. "He hasn't moved all night," one nurse whispered to another. "You'd think a man like him would hire someone to do this, but look at him." The other nurse nodded. "Money doesn't matter here. You can tell she's his whole heart." Inside the room, Richard sat hunched in a chair, watching Amara's tiny chest rise and fall. He thought about how fragile she looked. Just hours earlier, she had been running through the mansion's halls, laughing as she played with the puppy he had given her for her birthday. Now she lay there pale, her eyelids heavy, her little hand gripping his fingers even in her sleep. A lump rose in Richard's throat. For years, he had believed power was measured in skyscrapers, numbers, and wealth. He had thought that being successful meant building an empire, being respected, being feared even. But sitting there in the quiet of that hospital room, all of it seemed empty compared to this moment. All his wealth, his power, his reputation, none of it mattered compared to the bond he shared with Amara. She didn't care about the cars in his garage, the mansions he owned around the world, or the companies that bore his name. She just needed him, his love, his comfort, his presence. Looking at her peaceful face, Richard whispered, "You saved me, Amara. I thought I had everything, but you showed me what really matters." His voice cracked, and he brushed away a tear before it could fall onto her hand. He thought back to the years before she came into his life. His mansion had been filled with silence, his heart with loneliness. He remembered sitting at his long dining table, eating meals alone while the clinking of cutlery echoed in the emptiness. He had money, yes, but he had no laughter, no warmth, no family. Then one day he walked into that orphanage and saw a little girl clutching a worn teddy bear, too shy to speak, but with eyes so full of hope and pain that they pierced his soul. From that moment, everything changed. And now here she was, lying in a hospital bed, reminding him again that life's greatest treasures weren't locked away in safes or measured in stock prices. They were found in love, in the gentle squeeze of a small hand, in the quiet sigh of a child finally falling asleep, knowing she wasn't alone. The hours dragged on, but Richard didn't sleep. His body ached from the chair, his eyes burned from exhaustion, but he refused to close them. Every time Amara stirred, he leaned forward, whispering, "Daddy's here." Every time she whimpered, he smoothed her hair and kissed her forehead. When she drifted off again, he sat back, watching her as though she were the most precious thing he had ever owned. And she was. At one point, the night nurse quietly entered to check her for. She smiled softly at Richard. "She's lucky to have you," she said. Richard shook his head. His voice was low, but steady. "No, I'm the lucky one." When the nurse left, Richard leaned closer to Amara and whispered, "You gave me back my heart. I didn't even realize how empty I was until you filled my life with your laughter, your questions, your hugs. You're the only thing I never want to lose, Amara. And I swear to you, I will never let you down." The moonlight filtered through the blinds, casting stripes across the bed. Richard sat there, shoulders heavy, but heart strangely light, because he knew he was exactly where he needed to be. For once, he wasn't the man chasing the next deal, the next fortune, the next conquest. He was simply a father, keeping watch over his little girl. By dawn, Amara stirred, blinking open her eyes. They were tired, but clearer now. She saw him and whispered with a small smile, "Daddy, you're still here." Richard leaned down, kissing her forehead. "Always," he said firmly. "I will always be here." For the first time that night, he allowed himself to close his eyes for a moment, resting his head gently against her hand. The world outside could wait. The meetings could wait. Everything could wait. Because nothing in the world mattered more than the promise he silently renewed that night, to love, to protect, and to always be there for the little girl who had given him back his soul. The next morning, sunlight filtered softly through the hospital blinds, casting a warm glow across the room. Amara stirred, her small fingers tightening around her father's hand. Slowly, her eyes fluttered open, and she gave him a faint but brave smile. "Daddy," she whispered weakly, "it doesn't hurt as much now." Richard's heart swelled with relief. He leaned down and kissed her forehead gently. "That's because you're the bravest girl I know," he murmured, brushing a strand of hair away from her face. For the first time since the night before, Richard allowed himself to breathe fully. He could see the sparkle returning to her eyes. It wasn't much, just a hint of a lively little girl who usually danced through the mansion, but it was enough to ease the weight that had pressed on his chest all night. A few hours later, after the doctor confirmed that Amara could go home, he handed Richard a small slip of paper. "This is her prescription," the doctor said. "Antibiotics, rest, and plenty of love. You brought her in just in time. She's going to be just fine." Richard's eyes softened as he looked at his daughter, who was now sitting up in bed, swinging her legs shyly over the side. He held her close, then turned to the doctor with a faint smile. "You said she's lucky to have a father who cares," Richard said quietly. "But the truth is, I'm the lucky one." The doctor gave him a knowing smile, and Richard carried Amara out of the hospital, her head resting on his shoulder, her tiny arms wrapped around his neck. For once, the billionaire didn't notice the curious stares, the whispers of people recognizing him. The only thing that mattered was the warmth of his daughter in his arms. That day marked a turning point in Richard's life. He had always been a man of discipline, his days packed with meetings, phone calls, and business trips. His calendar used to be filled with nothing but deadlines and deals. But now, everything revolved around Amara. He still ran his empire. After all, thousands of people depended on him. But he ran it differently. If there was a school play at 3 o'clock, his meetings ended at 2:30. If Amara had a doctor's appointment, his assistants knew not to schedule anything that morning. If she wanted to show him the drawing she made in art class, he gave her his full attention, no matter how many emails piled up. At night, he traded late-night conference calls for bedtime stories. He would sit on the edge of her bed, book in hand, while Amara snuggled beneath her blankets, her eyes wide with wonder. Sometimes she fell asleep before he even finished the story, her little hand still clutching his. And instead of rushing back to his office, Richard often stayed, watching her breathe, marveling at how peaceful she looked. Weekends were no longer about networking dinners or private jet trips to business hubs. They became about picnics in the park, afternoons at the zoo, and painting messy pictures together in the mansion's garden. Richard would sometimes catch himself laughing so hard his stomach hurt, something he hadn't done in years. All because of the little girl who had turned his life upside down in the best way possible. Even his employees noticed the change. The once intimidating billionaire, who rarely smiled, now walked into the office with a softer demeanor. He asked about their families, their children, even attended the company's family day with Amara holding his hand. Some whispered that fatherhood had changed him. Richard didn't deny it, because it was true. One evening, after a long day at work, Richard returned home to find Amara waiting at the door. She jumped into his arms with her usual excitement. "Daddy, guess what? I got a gold star in class today." Richard lifted her high into the air, spinning her around until she squealed with laughter. "That's because you're amazing," he said proudly. "I'm so proud of you, Amara." And in that moment, Richard realized again how little he cared about the numbers in his bank account. The sound of her laughter was worth more than every fortune he had ever built. Years later, when people asked him what his greatest investment was, he didn't point to his companies, his skyscrapers, or his wealth. He pointed to Amara. Because in the end, it wasn't wealth that defined him. It wasn't the billions in the bank, the headlines in newspapers, or the luxury that surrounded him. What defined Richard Hamilton was the little girl who had once stood in the doorway of his mansion, clutching her ear and crying, "Dad, my ear hurts." That night had reminded him of something greater than money, something he had nearly forgotten in his endless chase for success. It reminded him that even billionaires need something far more valuable than riches. They need love. They need family. And every time Amara looked up at him with those bright eyes and whispered, "Daddy," Richard knew with absolute certainty she was his real fortune. In the end, it wasn't his billions or his empire that defined him. It was the love of a little girl who reminded him what truly matters: family. Sparkling Heart, if this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that prove love is the greatest wealth of all.